Thank you for joining Pulse TV. I'm your host, Cindy Peister, and today we're visiting with Professor Peter Dale Scott. Professor Scott was a Canadian diplomat. He taught 30 years with UC Berkeley teaching English. He's a poet. His poem Road to Jakarta, one of the most important poems in decades, political poem. He's the foremost voice for peace, an author of numerous books independently and also co-authoring with other authors. He has a new book out, American War Machine, Deep Politics, the CIA Global Drug Connection, and the Road to Afghanistan. Professor Scott, thank you so much.
I'm glad to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. You know, when you decided to write this book, what made you decide to write it? What is the premise of the book?
Well, it really, I've been writing now since the Vietnam War, and every new book that I've written, there are about 6 or 7, grow out of my original frustration at seeing America go into Vietnam. And I had been a Canadian diplomat for 4 years, had a tiny bit of exposure to the Indochina question and the agonies of the French at that time. And so I began by simply wanting to keep America out of Vietnam. But the more I researched this, I became interested in the forces that drew us into Vietnam. And particularly what distinguished my Vietnam research, that I became quite obsessed with the fact that the essential commitment to escalate the war into an American war was made the weekend of November 22nd, 1963, within 48 hours of the assassination of President Kennedy. So those two subjects, assassination and war, have been linked in my mind. And of course, I've gone hot and cold on this and was relatively inactive in the 80s and 90s. Well, the 90s I did a book about the Kennedy assassination, but when we had 9/11, and then that was immediately followed by a new war, first in Afghanistan and also, as clearly was going to happen, in Iraq. That, I guess, is the immediate cause why I wrote really 2 books, the Road to 9/11, which came out in 2007, and then I had some chapters left over that didn't fit into the Road to 9/11. I thought they were the best chapters, so, which is about the rise of the drug trade in Southeast Asia and the role of the CIA. So I essentially wrote the book to create a home for those chapters, and then while I was writing it, the war in Afghanistan escalated, so my book, this latest book, American War Machine, spans the period from the early 50s and the growth of the drug trade in Southeast Asia up to Afghanistan and the growth of the drug trade there.
An incredible book, years of research in that. So I suggest to our audience, if you want to take a look and really understand a few decades of American politics, you might check this book out. It's excellent. Professor Scott, I wanted to ask you, you know, so much of our own American history, as it unfolds, is being hidden from us. For example, we didn't know that the weapons of mass destruction were not true at the time, and we went to war on that basis. So the term, the Matrix, American Empire, all of that kind of languaging, of a description of what's going on in the United States today, where Americans are blind to our own political involvement domestically and internationally. How would you reference that? How would you term that?
Yeah, I think the same way about this problem, and I'm very aware, and have been for really since the 60s, that there's, in addition to what the America that we read about in the newspapers, and there's also a deeper dimension to what's going on, which is why I've coined the phrase deep politics. That beneath the surface there are events that happen. I also now am talking, since 9/11, I've come to talk also about deep events. Events which are treated as totally external, like the killing of the president, supposed to have been done by a lone nut and therefore not very interesting historically, or 9/11, it's 19 people coming from Asia. I call these deep events because we've had a number of them now, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and over we develop more and more the sense that these are events we're not going to get the truth on, we're not going to go to the bottom of. And in the case of 9/11, it took 3 years before the president even agreed to, or sorry, 2 years, to have a commission. And the commission, more and more, even the chairman of it has said they didn't get to the bottom of things. They've said that people lied to them at the commission. Those of us who are aware of deep politics, that's what we now expect in a deep event, that there will be cover-up, that the American people will not be allowed to get to the truth of things. There's such elemental facts that are mysterious about 9/11 that weren't even looked at by the commission. There's not a word about them in the 9/11 report. For example, who were the hijackers? Now, we were given a list of names within an hour before the last plane went down. The FBI was sharing who the hijackers were, but within 6 days, there were about 3 or 4 people who came forward in other parts of the world and said, "That's me, that's my photograph," but obviously I wasn't on one of those planes. And the FBI, back in September 2001, said, "We will have to investigate this." Not a word about this in the 9/11 Commission report. It simply assumes that the names we have are the right names. And there's the question of how World Trade Center Building 7 went down. It wasn't hit by a plane. There was another building between it and the towers that didn't go down. And yet this building suddenly, about 5 o'clock that afternoon, collapsed in about 7 seconds. And that question had been given to the commission to look at, and there's not a word about it. So we're barely at square one with the 9/11 Commission report, and I have to say we still, after almost 50 years, don't know the truth of what happened in Dallas, Texas in 1963. Those are deep events, and they affect our history. It's not inconsequential that after Kennedy was killed, his plans to take troops out of Vietnam were annulled, and we were involved in a hot war in Vietnam. The excuse was the Tonkin Gulf incident of '64, but it's now absolutely clear, A, that the second incident, which is why American planes went and bombed North Vietnam and started the hot war with North Vietnam, it's now clear that incident didn't happen. And what's even more alarming, it's now clear that people in Washington knew that it hadn't happened before the authorization was given to go ahead and send planes to attack North Vietnam. So that's why we talk about deep politics and deep history and deep events and deep forces that are making this happen that we don't fully understand. And I've devoted my life to this, really, but I don't claim to really understand these things. I just claim to be aware of these problems that need to be resolved.
So you've described deep events, but how would you define the term? How would you define deep?
When something happens and it very quickly becomes clear that we're not going to get to the bottom of the deep event. And I don't know if many people had that reaction. I didn't pay so much attention to the Kennedy assassination, but I must say the moment that Lee Harvey Oswald, the supposed assassin, was killed on television by somebody who was quite strong links to the Dallas Underground, and that was covered up. It was clear to me back then in the mid-60s that this was I didn't call it that then, but this was an event where the truth was being concealed. And so I watched Watergate quite closely because I had the same feeling, and I watched Iran-Contra. I actually went to Washington. I was a background consultant to Senator Kerry when he was looking into the drug aspects of the Contra activities. And the strong sense, another thing in all these things, it turns out there's some kind of CIA or intelligence involvement in all of them, and that is the point of sensitivity, that these things aren't being, some of the things are not being exposed because the CIA doesn't want them exposed. That's very clear in the Kennedy assassination, and I would say increasingly clear now in those other events that I've mentioned as well.
In 1971, you had a personal experience that seems to have impact in your ongoing work now. Would you like to describe to us what happened and its relevance to your current work?
You're talking about an event with which I open this new book, American War Machine. And ironically, I now think it was quite a significant event. But I'll tell it first, and then you'll see why I think it's important. I had already published an article about narcotics and the war in Vietnam, and the involvement of the CIA in helping to back the troops in Burma that were growing the poppy, which was creating a huge source of income for capitalists in Southeast Asia. And a friend of mine, Alfred McCoy, was working on a similar book. His book came out, both our books came out the next year. Al McCoy was on his way, by the way, his book, The Politics of Heroin, is the Bible now in this area. That was a mainstream book, a bestseller, and it's still in print after 30 years. On his way to Southeast Asia, he stopped here in Berkeley with me. I told him that I had been at a kind of unofficial war tribunal with a veteran of Special Forces who said he had seen heroin or opium being loaded onto CIA planes of Air America. We phoned to him in Palo Alto and said, would he do an interview? And he said, yes, he'd be happy to. So the next morning, Al and I drove in his car down to Palo Alto, and we reached this address. We walked up some steps and rang the doorbell, and the man came out with his fingers to his lips like this, indicating he didn't want us to talk. And okay, and then he motions us back down the stairs to his MG, which is parked in the street. And the MG has a steel door with a hole about this big in it, a huge hole. And he said, now he's talking down on the sidewalk, and he says, look at that hole. And he said, look at the floor of my MG. It's wooden, it's not even scorched, he said. That was an implosive device. It had to come from my old unit, so I can't talk to you. Well, what this meant was that somebody was listening to the phone call made from my house, and we had, I think by definition, this was a tiny act of terrorism, a relatively harmless one. All that got hurt was a car, but it was intended to terrorize him into not speaking, which is what he did. You know, I haven't had many things like this happen in my life. You would think that I would remember it. I didn't. I forgot it. This is the point of the story, that it was so outside the scope of life as I normally live it in America that my brain, instead of processing it, just suppressed it. And I wrote a long poem, as you mentioned, Coming to Jakarta, which was recovering all these repressed memories. And one of the last ones I recovered, and it took about 2 years, was this event with the MG and the story about drugs that never got told to us. Well, I saw Al McCoy at a conference about 2 or 3 months later and asked him if he remembered, and as I expected, he didn't remember it either. And at first, I said, okay, Al, you know, we went to interview that guy. What happened? And he said, well, I guess we didn't interview him. I said, yes, why didn't we interview him? And slowly, but it took time, we recovered the memory in his brain too. And to this day, his memory of it is not exactly mine. But the latest edition of his book, The Politics of Heroin, as I say, this mainstream book, in the preface, he quotes about 8 stanzas of my poem. That's his way of describing what happened that morning in Palo Alto. So you could say, in a way, this was a deep event, but a very small one, but not with the political consequences of things like Watergate and 9/11. But there is, again, I mean, I ask people watching this show, how do you explain what happened here? And I'm still at a loss of words. I say, because it had to do with drugs, I blame it on what I call the global drug connection. But do I mean forces inside the government from law enforcement did it? Or was it people in the drug trade? Or was it, I believe that there's a gray area in between where that distinction is not as clear as we would like it to be. I remember, to give another example, one of the first big anti-war marches in Berkeley back in '65, we wanted to go to the Oakland Army terminal where they were loading supplies for Vietnam. We knew we would never get there, but we were able to march through Berkeley. But when we got to the Oakland border, the Oakland police were there, and so were the Hells Angels. Well, the Hells Angels were a motorcycle gang, and everybody knew, although I don't know that I could prove it from books or anything, that they were heavily involved in dope distribution in the city of Oakland. And there, they were right next to the Oakland police, helping to block us from going in. One of the Hells Angels actually rushed forward and broke the leg of a Berkeley policeman, but as far as I know, he was not arrested because the Hells Angels were a kind of unofficial law enforcement for the Oakland police, even though they were on the wrong side of the law. And there was a great deal of that back in the 60s. And I must say, in that respect, this is perhaps a better country now than it was then. Another episode I mentioned in the book was Lowell Bergman, who is now famous on Frontline, and there was even a movie about him. He produces shows for PBS. In those days, he was at a small alternative anti-war newspaper in San Diego, and luckily he wasn't there that night that some people came by and threw a firebomb into the newspaper's office. It could have killed somebody. And it turned out that this was done with the unofficial tolerance and protection of the San Diego police. That was, the police were using these kind of irregular forces, and that's the kind of thing that my study of deep politics has focused on. The involvement of the underworld in quite important activities. For years, I've said, and I think the world has come around to agree with me, that Ruby, who's presented in Jack Ruby, I'm sorry, for younger people, the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald on television on November 25th, 1963. The Warren Report said he was a loner. And it said that they actually, the FBI went to the Chicago underworld to the top people in the underworld and said, was he part of the mob? And Tony Accardo, who was the head of the Chicago underworld, said, no, he's not mob connected. And the Warren Report used that as proof that he wasn't mob connected. Well, he was mob connected, and one of my first books spent a lot of time proving that. And I must say that I think is accepted. The House Committee on Assassinations had a 1,000-page appendix, 1,000 pages about Jack Ruby's mob connections. So the House Committee on Assassinations produced a 1,000-page report appendix, which was Ruby's mob connections. But when I went through it, I realized that it too had been cherry-picked so that the crucial mob connections were left out of the 1,000 pages. This is more and more examples of how what reaches the public eye with respect to these deep events is heavily processed, and the most relevant parts are suppressed. And so I say, in addition to archival history, and I really fault the universities here that they continue to talk as if Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone killer. And we have one kind of history that comes out of history departments, and then we have another kind of history, deep history, which you can now, thank goodness, read on the internet and hear about in programs like yours. But we have, if we want to live in a civilized, up-to-date modern society, we pride ourselves on being an open society, and America deserves to pride itself on that. In many ways, it is a remarkable job of different national, ethnic groups and so on living together in a relatively open society. But there is this dark area of deep politics and unexplained deep forces. And I doubt that in my lifetime I will ever know the facts about how the door of that MG was blown open by an incendiary device. I just don't expect it to know that.
For our viewers, Professor Scott has written 4 different books related to the Kennedy assassination. Isn't that correct, Professor Scott?
Well, it depends what you call a book.
Okay.
The big one is Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. Before that, there was a sort of monograph called Crime and Cover-Up. And recently, there's a reissue of a book I did in 1972 called The War Conspiracy. But in the back of it, I have quite extended comparisons of 2 deep events that look totally dissimilar. The Kennedy assassination on 11/22/63, and then the events of 9/11/2001. But there are actually some rather disturbing similarities, and I'll just give 2. One is that the culprits were identified almost immediately with information that information was sent out that conformed to what was said. I'll take the Oswald example. Within 15 minutes, they were looking for someone who was 9 feet 11, 165 pounds, and aged in their 30s. That corresponds with the height and the weight are exactly what was in Oswald's FBI file. It unfortunately wasn't Oswald's actual weight. He was, when they weighed his body 2 days later, wasn't 165 pounds, it was 141, which is quite significantly different. And yet, they used that to look for Oswald. And similarly, they had all these names of the hijackers within an hour, but it's now quite clear that whatever the facts about the hijackers, those were stolen identities, even to the photographs of. But one of the people who was living said, yes, I lost my passport some years ago. And there was this freak thing that they found 2 passports. They found a passport near the towers with the name of one of the hijackers. They found another passport in Pennsylvania near the thing. Nothing is said about this in the 9/11 Commission report because it looks like planted evidence, and that's another similarity. There was planted evidence to lead, a paper trail leading to the culprits in both cases. So anyway, in this book, I go into 15 analogies, and I worked at this for some time, and it was getting close to the end before I realized that one of the biggest analogies of all is that both events were followed by America going into a crazy war that it should not have gone into. First in Vietnam, more and more people now would say that was a tragic error, but it was also an obvious error. And then the same with Afghanistan, above all Iraq. Iraq was totally insane. And how do we have, in one of the most advanced countries in the world, the most highly educated, et cetera, what has happened to our politics that it has at its center, this is the title, American War Machine, there's an aspect, we have a public constitution that's excellent, we have all kinds of processes for elections and so on, which on paper at least are very good. But at the center, particularly since World War II, we have developed a more and more highly concentrated secret apparatus that gets us involved in wars. And if we don't do something about it, it's going to get us involved in more wars. Because even if we get out of Afghanistan, as long as we have this war on terror, there's always going to be some terror. Terror isn't even an enemy, it's a technique. And if we were to be lucky enough to see, as President Obama wants, to see us start withdrawing from Afghanistan in 2011, and if that ends in peace, I make a certain prediction that drug production will go way down in Afghanistan, just as in the 1970s it went way down in Indochina, but then concurrently started to go way up in Afghanistan. So I foresee that if we get peace in Afghanistan and orderly control of the regions where the drugs are grown, drug production will go down in Afghanistan and will go up somewhere else, maybe Yemen, maybe Somalia. And if we don't do something about Washington, we will have new wars in Somalia. I've just started reading Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, and he confirms what I already had read, that by the time Obama became president, the CIA was fighting the war on terror in 60 countries. This is a bigger world war than World War I and World War II when it comes to geography. Those wars weren't fought in 60 countries. And my understanding is that in the 2 years that Obama has been president, that it has expanded to still more countries. And Congress isn't doing anything about this. And the American public aren't even aware of it. That's why I keep saying we have to be aware of these things going on in the background, because in the seeds, probably in these 60 countries, it's very small operations. But if they're unchecked, they grow and grow and grow. And particularly in Yemen right now, I think and Pakistan, of course, I should have mentioned. These are two countries where it's not small anymore, and America is sending drones into both countries and is sending people on the ground into both countries. And as I say, if it's not checked, it will get much bigger.
You say Congress isn't playing a role in this particularly. What would you say to the media's role in keeping the American people in the blind on so many of our key issues?
Yes, when I talk about the American war machine, the focus may be in Washington, but it isn't just Washington. President Eisenhower alerted us to the dangers of a military-industrial complex. And that is what we are dealing with now. When, you know, he made that warning in 1961, and it was still, I would have said, a minority sector of the American economy and American industrial system and so on. It has grown and grown. There was a chance for it to shrink after we pulled out of Vietnam. And in both my books, Road to 9/11 and this one, I look at the 70s. It was a choice of go back to being a trading nation and cut back on the military. And some people wanted to do that, but some other people said, no, 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 we're pulling out of Vietnam, but that means we have to increase our defense budget. And the second group were certainly a minority when it comes to public opinion, but they were very well financed by the military-industrial complex, and they are the group that succeeded, so that we now essentially have a military economy in this country. We are not the kind of producers of all kinds of goods that we used to be. Automobiles, forget it. You would say there's some areas where we're still cutting edge, like aircraft were pretty good, electronics were extremely good, computers, all that sort of thing. Those are war-related industries and is the key to our dominance in civilian electronics like iPhones and so on. The bottom of that is the miniaturization of electronics, which was subsidized by the U.S. government as part of its military and space development plans. So we are a war economy, and the newspapers, which was your question, are part of, Eisenhower didn't mention newspapers, and I have to say, this is a big difference between the Vietnam War and the Afghan War and Iraq War, that the newspapers provided about the only, and television, the media provided the only large-scale criticism of the war that we had back then. There were also individual observers on the ground, but the newspapers did a relatively good job of reporting about how the war wasn't working the way that General Westmoreland was reporting that it was working. And this is what helped fuel that, and the draft helped fuel the anti-war movement that was a factor in bringing the war to the end. Now, newspapers are more dependent than ever on the government for their information. And particularly in Iraq, all the reporters were embedded in the troops. They were really subject to military discipline. They went where the army said they could go, and they didn't go where the army said they couldn't go. And this is another factor in this has been, as my friend Ben Bagdikian has written about, my friend and neighbor, that there's been corporate consolidation of the media, and specifically the gap between the military industrial complex and the media complex has narrowed, and you had firms, big corporate firms that were in the war business bought the media. And when particularly ABC at a certain point was being more critical than the other networks of what was going on in government. And this was at a time when William Casey was the head of the CIA, and a corporation that William Casey had a personal connection to bought ABC. And in ways like this, and that's not the only factor. I mean, corporate concentration is one. Another is that the major source of significant news being the government, the so-called responsible media have to maintain good relations with the government or they won't get the information. And that was one of the issues with the Pentagon Papers, that when the Washington Post and the New York Times defied Nixon and published the papers he didn't want published, the response of Mitchell, who was Nixon's Attorney General, was, we're going to punish the Washington Post, take away its TV license. And in the end, there was then a battle royal, and in the end, the Washington Post, New York Times won, and Nixon resigned. But if Nixon hadn't resigned, I think the Washington Post would have lost its television license, and that is an object lesson which all the media remember, that they are dependent, particularly in television, which is a matter of licenses, dependent on government favors. So we are facing a war machine that reaches into the economy, reaches into the media, and this is an aspect I didn't write so much, but reaches into the academy, that political science professors get their promotions by books that are subsidized by the CIA, by their access to sitting on committees in Washington. That gives them status. That casts a shadow over the whole political science field of the academy. And that's why my PhD was in political science, but I chose to follow a different career and taught in English, where I didn't have to deal with that, well, not deal as much with that kind of shadow cast over the academy.
Professor Scott, in your book, you make a reference to the financial military-industrial complex. Would you like to elucidate on that a little bit?
Yes. I think that, by the way, President Eisenhower's speech about the military-industrial complex was very important and very accurate at that time. And it's interesting that he had to do it more or less in secret. Most of his staff were unaware he was going to do this. But it's grown since his time, and so it's true. I will now talk, actually at one point I think I said the financial, excuse me, financial petroleum military industrial complex. New York, Wall Street has always been behind the CIA and so on, but Wall Street investments in the military-industrial complex have become more and more important to firms like Lehman Brothers. It's defunct now, but it became giant because of its investment in the military-industrial complex. And other firms still surviving, Goldman Sachs, all did the same things. And I actually, in The Road to 9/11, trace the career of one man. He begins as a military officer, and then he's an officer in one of the defense industries, and then he ends up in New York with one of the big financial firms. So there is that unity linking the financial world to the others. Also, petroleum is huge. I mean, some of our biggest multinational corporations are Exxon, Chevron, and they work with the CIA closely, and they are one of the major consumers of petroleum is the U.S. Armed Forces. A great deal of oil used to be the Navy, but now I imagine the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are major things. So, and all the stuff that's going on in Central Asia, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, it's clear that America sees that the world's oil reserves are running out, that most of the unproven reserves are well, Iraq itself, but also places like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, oil and gas, maybe not quite as much as they thought at one time there would be. But the covert politics, the reason why Casey, for example, used Arab Afghans to cross into Russia, into the Soviet Union, and stir up trouble there is they were playing a kind of covert politics which led to the breakup of the Soviet Union, which led to Chevron and Exxon being major investors now in Kazakhstan. And they want to have U.S. troops somewhere near so that the heads of these countries will think of themselves as friends of America and not, as they would otherwise, friends of Russia. And there's quite a lot being played out there under the surface that involves the petroleum companies along with the CIA and the U.S. armed forces. And the petroleum side of things, it's complicated. I can't give it to you in a sentence, but it certainly underlies why we have fought wars in both Afghanistan and in Iraq. So it is a complex, it's not the same thing. Some people would just say America is a fascist dictatorship, and I never say that. I don't believe it. I do believe that America is a constitutional democracy whose processes have been threatened and in part superseded by this American war machine, which takes advantage of the openness of American politics, and as the decades go by, has more and more money to dominate the political process, so that it's becoming harder and harder to use democracy to defeat this war machine. But it's important to keep in mind that the war machine is not America, and that is vividly illustrated, for example, in 1963, when you have a president who is determined to start taking troops out of Vietnam, and the war machine is already equally determined to escalate the war in Vietnam, and the result is a head-on collision, and the president is assassinated in a deep event which to this day remains unsolved.
Professor Scott, do we have a precedent with COINTELPRO with what's going on today?
COINTELPRO was a series of programs. They were actually FBI programs, short for counterintelligence. But what it was in practice was infiltration of the anti-war. The big ones were against the Martin Luther King, against the Black Panthers. I was in a little Bay Area institute. All we did was publish stuff about the war, and there were only about 12 of us. I believe there was a COINTELPRO directed against us, and I remember I gave a talk by invitation only to about 10 people. It was all arranged over the phone, and an 11th person turned up. None of us knew him. And he said, "Oh, I heard about it on KPFA." Well, he certainly didn't. He was penetrating our little thing. That was a major aspect of America in the time of the Vietnam War, and also of it affected very much the various African-American movements like the Black Panthers. Could be quite bloody there. People were set up to be killed, and some of them murdered. The head of the Black Panthers in Chicago was flat out murdered by the Chicago police. He was asleep in bed, and they came in and riddled him with machine gun bullets. The CIA was also at that time, quite illegally, it was not in their charter, but they had Operation Chaos, which was also surveillance on, and I think more than surveillance on, I've seen the Operation Chaos documents on one man whose offense was that he turned up at a protest with a placard, and the CIA did an investigation on him to find out who he was. So of course, it doesn't have to be called COINTELPRO now, because thanks to 9/11, we had the institution of, right that very morning, before the last plane went down, the institution of what are called continuity of government procedures. And this is something I've been talking a lot about recently, and I talk about in American War Machine. Secret plans that Cheney and Rumsfeld, among others, had been working on for 20 years. Originally plans for a response to a nuclear attack, so they're very extreme plans, like suspending the Constitution, imposing military government. Two of them, very clear from what we know from the 1980s when they were working on it, warrantless surveillance and warrantless detention. And since 9/11, we've had both of those. People have no idea how the impact on on Muslims in this country, Arabs in this country, how many of them were surveilled in this way, and how many of them were detained without. Habeas corpus is something that goes back to Magna Carta and to the Bill of Rights in England in the 17th century, and it's mentioned in. What's mentioned in the Constitution are the conditions under which you can override it, but the assumption is you will have it. We don't have it because of continuity of government. And I must say, and there's a state of emergency that justifies the continuity of government proceedings. And when Obama was elected, a former congressman and I appealed to Obama and appealed to the Congress to do something about the state of emergency and to do something about these COG regulations. And there's actually a statute. One of the post-Watergate reforms was a statute that says if there's an emergency proclaimed, Congress must, not has the right to, but must, by law, review that state of emergency and either approve it or terminate it. Well, we've had a state of emergency now for 10 years, or 9 years, and Congress hasn't done what by law it should do, and when I tried to mount some kind of nationwide protest on this, one of the congressmen replied to a constituent, and he said, well, that's because that statute has been overridden by continuity of government. Well, I've been saying all along that continuity of government has superseded the Constitution, and this, if true, would be an example of it. Another is that in 2007, when George Bush extended the proclamation of emergency, he appended in an appendix certain continuity of government new procedures, and the Congressman Pete DeFazio from Oregon, under pressure again from the 9/11 Truth Movement, asked to see those measures. He was on the Homeland Security Committee, which would have been the relevant House committee. He was told he couldn't see them. So he got the chairman of his committee to sign a letter with him requesting to see them. And they were told, I think they were told they didn't have the clearance to see them. So here's a whole aspect of government which is in effect superseding the regular government, and Congress is told it doesn't have the right to look at it. I consider this extremely important, and again, it's unfortunate that so few Americans know about it, but I wish they would go and Google, for those of you who have computers and web access, Google for continuity of government or proclamation of emergency and see this terrible situation we're in, where apparently Congress is told they don't have the power. Well, if we don't have checks and balances, we don't have the American Constitution as it was designed, and we should at least know that.
Professor Scott, what is the significance of the current role of surveillance and detention in the creation of what I would call the matrix mindset? I'm thinking of Brzezinski, FEMA connection, and what is the real grand chessboard?
Well, the last thing you asked was about Brzezinski's grand chessboard, and
Okay.
he has described geopolitics as a kind of game of chess in which the major powers of the world are struggling to win control of the geopolitical center of the world, which is Central Asia. And I have a chapter in my book about the real grand chessboard, which is talking about geopolitics, and I'm glad we brought this up. To some people, geopolitics is a science, and there have been some sensible papers written in it. But underlying it is the idea of total control of the world, which is the game that's being played. And this has reached into strategic planning in the Pentagon, and they actually have this strategic dominance document, which I quote from, which is saying that it is the objective of the United States to have the power to control any situation anywhere in the world. And I am asking us to step back for a moment and realize that this is insane, just totally insane. If America can't control a country like Afghanistan or a country like Iraq, it surely should have learned in the last decade that it can't even control, enlarge a country, let alone control any situation in that country. And yet, that is what the strategic planning, thanks to geopolitical thinkers like Brzezinski, not just Brzezinski, Cheney is equally guilty, Rumsfeld probably equally guilty. But certainly Cheney, when he was Secretary of Defense under George Bush I, tried to push this doctrine onto thing, and it is insane, and it's particularly ironic that the man who developed this, what's his name, Mackinder, back in 1919, he developed this doctrine of geopolitics at a time when Britain had technically won the First World War, but in so doing had weakened itself to the extent that it was no longer going to play the role that was being depicted for it in theory by geopolitics. And geopolitics was then taken over by the Nazis, and that was the source of their Drang nach Osten, the idea that they would drive to the east and create a Reich that would last for 1,000 years. That was their doctrine, and the Reich didn't last 1,000 years. It lasted barely a decade. And now America, at the stage where it essentially has lost its cutting-edge dominance. It is still a dominant power, but it's not dominant the way it was in the 1950s, when it dominated militarily and also economically and also financially. Well, we still dominate militarily, but like Britain in 1919, we are no longer the financial and economic power. We have sacrificed our financial and economic power to preserve a military establishment that we don't need and is in the long run going to do us more harm than good, and certainly isn't protecting us from terrorism. I want to make that point. Some good progress is being made against Al-Qaeda in the last decade. It has all been police work. The military efforts have been a disaster, and we have just put now 100,000 new troops, and there's that many more mercenaries or contractors. And how many Al-Qaeda are in Afghanistan? According to the advisors to Obama, less than 60. They've all moved somewhere else. We put the military into Afghanistan, and they did the obvious thing and moved next door to Pakistan. So are we then going to invade Pakistan, which has nuclear weapons? I sincerely hope we don't, but I don't totally rule it out. I don't totally rule out action against Iran, which Israel desperately wants, and which may or may not happen. But my big point is that this doctrine of geopolitics is a kind of rationalization for military power that is part of the disease. It is corrupted thinking. It's very profitable thinking. In the chapter, when I talk about the real grand chessboard, I'm talking about all these private military corporations and private intelligence corporations who are in this for profit. And therefore, their motives, they should not be allowed to lay a finger on strategic planning, because they will obviously plan for what is profitable. And, you know, a lot of words were wasted trying to figure out why we made a mistake about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Well, the simple answer is we made that mistake collectively as a nation because we relied on private intelligence from private intelligence contractors like SAIC in particular, who had a profit reason to say that they were there. And it's particularly a sign of how bad things have got in Washington that the question of finding out why we made that mistake was contracted out to a private contractor, which was SAIC. So SAIC was given the job of investigating itself, and no surprise, they failed to mention that SAIC had been a big part of the reason why we went in. Because our intelligence now is being handed out to private contractors. Surveillance is being handed out to private contractors. And this is a mask, by the way, for the militarization of police work in this country, which was done in 2002 as a result, I would say, of COG, when we created a military command for America, NORTHCOM. We have a SOUTHCOM for South America, CENTCOM for Central Asia. NORTHCOM for North America hasn't, you know, we're not fighting a war here yet, but on the intelligence level and surveillance level, they are involved at the grassroots level together with private contractors and with local police agencies. And this is a militarization of the way this country is run, that there were statutes that expressly forbade this, the so-called Posse Comitatus Acts, which limited any military involvement to extreme emergency. And that is a dead letter now, because they're involved with everything. And as I say, it's very disappointing that the Democrats coming in 2009, they had the presidency, they certainly controlled the House, they barely controlled the Senate from time to time, did nothing about this. So we're going to have to turn the country around, but it's going to have to come from outside the existing political process. It's going to have to be done on the level of mobilizing civil society to change what's happening, and particularly to train Americans that against money. And there's so much money now coming in that American voters are going to have to just figure out which candidate's getting the most money and vote for the opposite one, because money is the source of the corruption.
Professor Scott, in your book, you talk quite a bit about Mexico. Could we touch on Mexico, the relevance of Mexico in all of this?
Yeah, well, I chose to begin my looking at the global drug connection abroad because it is the country where, first of all, the FBI has been active the longest, and it is also the country where whose drug trafficking is most intimately linked to American consumption. And as we can see from the headlines from day to day, it is a point where the drug forces in Mexico have penetrated government, and they are fighting a war now where you don't even know which side the drug forces are on, because most of the significant drug victories against drug kingpins are done with the help of other drug kingpins who want to see them overthrown. So it is a very corrupt society, and and they've also, I don't want to sound anti-Mexican, it is a country where some very courageous efforts to deal with this at great risk and at great loss of life. It's almost 30,000 people now who've died in the drug wars in Mexico. This is a state of war. And what I, in my chapter, want to point out that one of the culprits here is the CIA, who built up a connection with a particular Mexican agency. It's now defunct, but the successor agencies are still there, called the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the DFS, that the CIA knew it was involved in drug trafficking and simultaneously preferred to work with it over all other agencies. It's a little metaphor for what has happened all over the world, where the CIA has done the same sort of thing in Thailand, in Lebanon, in Vietnam with Ngo Dinh Nhu, and I mean, I could go and with Ali Walid Karzai, the brother of the president of Afghanistan. But the results have been so disastrous in Mexico, and we've seen that no American agency has done what it should have done. Even then they had a great sting in this Operation Casablanca, where they lured a lot of people into a bank to launder the funds and then arrested them. And eventually the whole thing was hushed up at a higher level. This was in Nevada. America was in a position to put these people in jail. No, it was, it's always a question of higher political concerns, and so it's not even properly written about. I'm one of the very few books, I think, that mentions it.
So Banamex was involved in laundering the drug money?
All the banks were, including Banamex. And what helped me there was it Robert Rubin, who was then the Secretary of the Treasury, who killed the investigation. Then he went back to, I think it was Citibank, and Citibank simply bought Banamex, and then Citibank got involved in its own drug money laundering scandals. But I don't want to pick on one bank.
Right.
There's another bank, Wachovia, admitted to laundering $485 billion. And they paid a fine of, I'm doing this from memory, I may be wrong, something like 30 or 40 billion dollars. And again, the whole thing is hushed up because Wachovia is defunct, taken over by the bank where I bank, Wells Fargo. But this is a reminder to us that although it's always presented to us in the media as if the Taliban is profiting from drug money, everybody's profiting, including big banks in America, which over and over will plead no contest and pay a fine, which is always a tiny percentage of the money that they made. There was a bank in Boston that was dealing directly with the underworld in Boston, laundering their funds. It's not usually as naked as that. More usually they are the ones in New York that create a private bank, and then the brother of the president of Mexico comes with a few $100 million he would like to deposit, and no questions are asked. They've created the bank to deal with these deposits. President of Nigeria, the same thing, profitable to the banks in Boston. And the head of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, when we had the huge downturn in 2007, he said, and it wasn't very well reported in this country, that he knew of banks that only survived in that downturn by laundering drug money. Drug money is a significant factor there are all kinds of estimates, and not all of them are useless, I would say. But the fact is, they're a significant factor in the global economy that I think the top three, just on a question of values in trade, the top three commodities on the international markets in whatever order are petroleum, arms, and drugs. And drugs and arms go together because where you have an illicit drug trade, frequently one way that they're paid for is arms going in the other direction, although it melds into all kinds of things, into stolen cars, into trafficking with humans, essentially the sex slave trade, which is very big. All of these things grow out of drugs. That's why it's so important. We should be dealing with drugs, and we're not dealing with drugs. And in fact, the easiest way to deal with drugs can be done right here in this country, which would be to legalize them. And maybe when I say legalize, I really mean decriminalize. You can still, we don't want to see massive drug consumption in this country. You can establish controls on how drugs are consumed. But you have to take the big profits out of it, and that would be the best way to shrink the global drug traffic. And as long as we have people in Washington, as we do now, saying we will never talk about legalization, they are saying we will continue to make it easy for the drug traffickers to reap these huge profits. Marijuana, for example, is a big issue right now. If people could grow their own marijuana, for one thing, they would be consuming a much less potent part of it, because sinsemilla and all these variants of marijuana have been developed so that you can pack more power into less space. That is being to meet the needs of drug trafficking, illegal drug trafficking. If California could tax the marijuana industry in California, it could get out of its economic crisis very quickly. I doubt it's going to happen because the financial interests are too big now. It's going to be very, but that would be a way to start.
You said in your book that the United States backdoor covert foreign policy has been the single largest cause of the illicit drugs flooding the entire world. Could you talk about how the opium and poppy production, the poppy growth and opium production in Afghanistan is funding our wars today?
Where I can talk with most confidence is back in time, right after World War II. The world drug trade was severely interrupted by World War II and was, right after the war, insignificant. Since that time, it is built up very, very rapidly, and you can trace where it was built up. If I could just talk about opium and opiates. It built up first in Burma. Afterwards, that was with an army there that was being armed and financed, and it needed to be supplied by air, so we created an airline, a CIA airline that flew arms in, and we had an arrangement with Taiwan and the Kuomintang there that they co-owned the planes, so the planes would fly the drugs out. These were landlocked armies in Burma. The CIA, well, I should say the United States, by its conscious decision to supply that army, was responsible for the building up of the drug trade in that area. Before the war, Burma was not a significant factor in the global drug trade, but it went in about a decade from maybe 80 tons to 800 tons, something like that. A huge increase. And as I've said already, this continued to increase. We're getting out of the Golden Triangle at the height of the war, something like 1,200 tons. When America pulled out of that area, the drug consumption drug production didn't disappear, but it shrank. And what is very alarming to me that where you have created the demand, production, supply will meet demand. And that's when you begin to see a buildup in Afghanistan, and then suddenly, lo and behold, the CIA is conducting covert operations in Afghanistan. Again, I'm condensing history, but there is no doubt that we supplied something like more than $1 billion, certainly, to Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and about half of that went to one single man, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who in that period became arguably the largest heroin trafficker in the world. So everywhere where the CIA has been involved, no, I put it the other way around. Everywhere that drug production has increased rapidly like this, it is more complicated than what I'm saying, but the general rule is you see that the CIA has been there. I should have mentioned Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley, which is also a source of drugs, both marijuana and now, to some extent, opium. And the CIA is no longer powerful the way it was, but in the 50s, when it built up, the CIA was involved with the people who were building it up. Cocaine in Colombia. Colombia has become the major source of, that is the country where the United States and the CIA have been most involved. And I will say that in 1990, I was at a drug conference just when President Bush announced his Andes project to fight a war. It was going to be a war on drugs. That was the name of it. And I said, if we fight that war in Colombia, I predict that the drug production will go up and the drug importation into this country will go up. And even I, in 1990, had no idea that in 10 years, the drug production would multiply by a factor of, it would be 3 times what it had been in 1990. So you want to end the import of drugs from Colombia and CIA operations in Colombia. It's very simple. It's not going to happen, but there is, yes, I say, I don't want to sound as if there's only one thing that made all this happen. It is a complicated story, and it's quite a big book where I write about it. But anyone who reads that book, I think, will share my feeling is that terribly wrong decisions were made, and which are by Americans, which are a major factor in the problem that we face today.
One of the pictures in your book, you have an American soldier walking through a poppy field in Afghanistan. We know that the amount of opium coming out of Afghanistan is multiplied. Could you speak to that?
In 2000, just before America went into Afghanistan, the Taliban, in response to, they wanted to be recognized because at that time only 3 countries recognized them, and America said, well, you'll have to get rid of the poppy production. Well, the Taliban used ruthless measures, but they did. They essentially got rid of it in their area, and the only drugs that came out of Afghanistan in that area came up in the northeast from Badakhshan, which was under the control of the Northern Alliance. Well, in 2001, America went into Afghanistan, and surprise, surprise, we went in, our allies were the Northern Alliance, and they had to make a decision in Washington, well, they're drug traffickers, but they're useful, we'll use them. And America not only allied with drug traffickers on the ground, they even brought a drug trafficker back from France, where he had retired, saying, we are going into Afghanistan, we want you to help us. So, then in short order, I don't even want to take the base year, the year that there was no drug production, but before that it was under 4,000 tons, and in 8 years it was 8,000 tons. And it's shrunk since then, but the major reason it's shrunk is that there are now various blights which are affecting the opium crop. It's a monoculture in huge areas of Afghanistan, and that has a result that there are natural consequences. It is still the source of something like 90% of the world's opiates. And this is all, before 1979, when the CIA first went in there, its contribution to the global drug trade was insignificant. And its contribution to American consumption was insignificant. After 1 year of American involvement, according to the Reagan government statistics, something like 60%. So there are consequences of doing these things. And if we were to go into Yemen in a big way, the same thing would happen again.
Professor Scott, very quickly, what is Force X?
I talked in The Road to 9/11 about a deep state in this country, drawing on the analogy of Turkey, where there's a very clearly established with CIA help, parallel state that with impunity kills people and finances itself from drugs and is allied with the security elements of the government. I decided in this country to go easy on the notion of a deep state. I'm linked to it a lot, but it connotes to people hearing it the idea that there's something in this country like there is in Turkey. Well, I don't see that. I do see that the public state at various points, and there's more than one, interfaces with powers outside, with the underworld, but particularly with what I call the overworld, people who are wealthy enough and have enough financial influence to guide policies. And that there has been those forces pushing us in the direction of militarization for decades. And I, in my book, talk about a Force X that is driving us that way. But I'm afraid that my real answer is you have to read my book, because it isn't something for which there's a simple answer, but I think there is a cumulative picture of bad decisions made, particularly in the CIA, to ally themselves with underworld elements and with drug trafficking elements, which has contributed. It turned us in Asia from having a defense establishment into having what was clearly now an offense establishment. And it's the offense establishment that got us into Vietnam, into Iraq, into Afghanistan, and we have to go back to having a defense establishment. But to deal with that, you've got to deal with all the factors I talk about in my book.
Professor Scott, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.